Hi, Kai.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Oh, I like what is going on there. I like the outfit. Very
Thank
nice.
you.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Good morning.
Morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So, welcome to the Ottawa Black Book Club. My name is Louisa, the founder and the host. So, in the course of our conversation, we'll have more people join in. So, more we join in, some will step out and some will come back in. But all the same, I just want to say thank you very much for making our time to join us today. Everybody, this is the author Kai Thomas. You already read his bio, which was short and straight to the point. So I'm just yeah. So I'm just gonna jump into this book. Yeah. First of all, as an African and as a Nigerian, this was, I would say, an eye-opening experience for me because when we hear and read about stories of everything that has to do with slavery, is connected to the United States and not to Canada. So I know that, yeah, Lawrence Hill had written stuff about that experience in Canada, and I think Dr. Afua Cooper has also written stuff like that. But I haven't seen it from this angle. So first of all, talk to us about this book and your inspiration for writing this book.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, big respect to Lawrence Hill, Dr. Phil Cooper, all the other Black Canadian writers and historians who really paved the way for me. I remember reading Lawrence Hill's, I think the first book of his I read was Any Known Blood. And I was like 13 years old. I grew up in Ottawa. So it's
Oh,
really
okay.
meaningful to have this conversation with your book club because like a home, even though I'm not there right now, it's like I'm home. So, those authors really did pave the way in very meaningful ways, from a historical perspective, Dr. Cooper, and fiction. She's dabbled in fiction as well. And, Lawrence Hill, many others, too many to name. But I guess in terms of the inspiration for writing this novel, I grew up Black in Canada. I had a sense based on the experience of growing up Black in Canada that it wasn't all the stories that Canada had told me in school and elsewhere about the history of this land. I got the sense that I wasn't getting the full picture. And so I remember learning about the Underground Railroad, and it seemed like a very limited story, a very limited way to tell the story of the Underground Railroad. And even the story of my own ancestors, my grandparents migrating to initially Montreal and then to Ottawa in the 1960s and early 70s. I didn't, and it wasn't until a few years ago, relatively later in my upbringing that I got to learn about um, these different aspects of Black Canadian history. And so I really wanted to write a book that I felt a young me would have been excited to read.
Okay.
So I love history, I love fiction, and it was important to me to really dig into some of the lesser known aspects of our history on this soil, to connect it to other places in the African diaspora as well as the continent. There's a brief chapter that um, references some of the characters' ancestors on the continent of Africa. And I wanted to tie it all together because I think um, that representation is really important both for Black folks who live in Canada, for people of all ethnicities who live in Canada, as well as elsewhere. Like, I think it should be known that there is a really interesting history that has to do with Black and Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Okay.
And I think that you know the general public is ready for uh, seeing my interpretation of what that might have looked like, and I certainly was ready to read it. And I think as a writer, at some point, I realized that one of the best ways to motivate myself is just to like stick with what I'm really excited to to write about. And so I just kind of followed that urge, and here we are.
Okay. And I was going to ask you about the style of writing because the
Sure.
style, this is very different.
Yeah.
So when I started it, it was moving on and I was, yeah, okay. And then the death of the slave catcher, okay. Then I go, oh, so why didn't she run away? But when I got to the part where Lucinda went to see the old lady in the cell in prison,
Yeah.
I expected that the next chapter would be them battering stories. But then it went on, and even when they started to share stories, I got a little confused. Then I went back again to say, okay, what's going on here? So my question there was, why didn't she run away? Because what I would have expected was you killed a white man.
Mm.
So the next thing would be for you to disappear. But she didn't run away. Rather, it was almost as if, she was thinking to herself, yeah, I mean, I've lived my life, so what the hell? Why didn't she run away? Yeah.
I think you said it. I mean, I think the character of Cash
Mhm.
she's nearing the end of her life,
Yeah.
and I think in has everybody here read the book? I don't want to give spoilers.
So most like I have read the book, some have read halfway, but it doesn't matter. Yeah, please go ahead and talk to us about it. They're gonna
Okay,
find time to finish it if they haven't.
I'll be I'll be careful in how I answer this question because
Okay.
I think that's one way to answer it. Is in some ways that may become clear when you get further along in the book. But essentially, from this character's perspective, from Cash's perspective, she has a job. She feels that she has a job to do in this place, and
Okay.
so she feels that she's done running, and this her arrival in Dunmore and then into the jail kind of marks a return to a place that in which she has unfinished business,
Okay.
and as one might start to pick up on, she seems to know things and have a sense of things that Lucinda does not,
Okay.
and there's a purpose, an important purpose to their conversation that the character of the old woman, is aware of,
Okay.
that she needs to kind of see through um, to to its end. So that's a kind of one way to answer the question, I guess. Yeah, yeah, she's done running. She's done running, and she's ready to kind of sit and see where this goes. And and they obviously have things to talk about, the two of
Okay.
them.
And
But
this is
yeah.
and this is the first time I have read a book where you spoke about where an author actually mentioned the relationship between enslaved black and indigenous people.
Mhm.
Because I can't remember the chapter, but I remember where the part that struck me was when you wrote about escape. And for you to escape from a white slave owner is to come back to torture and possibly death or hanging. But when you are bought by an indigenous owner, you become family. And when you escape and you are caught and brought back, you are still nurtured and treated with kindness. And still speak to us about that because I've never thought about, how I think in life sometimes we tend to overlook a lot of important things just staring at, just there. So this is the first time I'm actually reading about that black and indigenous relationship. And that was when it dawned on me that I have never thought about it. If I think of indigenous relations, I think of it in regards to white people, not the possibility that there could have been that relationship between indigenous and black people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Likewise,
talk to us
I
about
didn't know
that.
anything about the history of that before
Yeah.
getting
Mhm.
to research this book. And when I started reading historical texts
Yeah.
and primary source documents and just there's a number of books that I read that I'm very indebted to. I
Okay.
mean, you mentioned Dr. Afua Cooper. She has done some work around this, but some of the more there's a couple other books that I would recommend for those who are interested in reading history about this history in particular. There's
Mm-hmm.
a historian named Taya Miles,
Taya
who,
Miles. Okay.
yeah, she actually won the National Book Award in the U.S. last year for her most recent book.
Okay.
Um, but the one previous to that is the one that I read to research my novel, and it's called um, The Dawn of Detroit, and it's all about the
Okay.
black and indigenous. It's all about slavery and the slave society that was Detroit in the 18th century. She really kind of focuses more on the 18th century.
Okay.
Um, so that's a region that's kind of important to certain chapters in the novel. But these are historians. So Taya Miles is one. Another one is a man named Brett Rushforth, who did a who wrote a book called Bonds of Alliance, and it's
Okay.
all about slavery in the French Atlantic world. And so
Okay.
we're talking about, so-called New France, so what is now Quebec, and the French relationships with all of the indigenous nations who uh, practiced slavery in their own way. And so it was a good reminder to me that, okay, if we're going back to the 19th century and the 18th century,
Mm-hmm.
the most dominant system of slavery was white people enslaving black people, and that's important, and that should be recognized. However, most societies were practicing some form of enslavement, and that includes indigenous peoples, both both in North America, was known as North America, as well as in Africa, and so I wanted to dig into that a little bit and see what that looked like. And one of the differences that one of this historian Brett Rushforth talks about is that the indigenous peoples weren't necessarily enslaving for the purpose of uh, creating this huge economy of plantation labor. That's
Uh,
a very big difference, right? Uh,
yes.
it's a big difference in terms of the amount of slaves you need. It's a big difference in terms of how you treat them.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of cases, Brett Rushforth talks about how indigenous forms of slavery in what's now Canada, it looked different. It was almost more of an adoption
Mm-hmm.
into the family, into the tribe, into the nation, and it didn't necessarily um, mean that as an enslaved person you would always be enslaved, and it didn't necessarily mean that you couldn't rise in status
Okay.
in the tribe. So there's a lot of complexity and nuance, but I was interested in that because the other thing that I learned was that in Canada, for example, there were more indigenous slaves than there were African slaves.
Oh,
So yeah, so this becomes an interesting question, because then you look at, the legacies of slavery and how it's impacted Black people. This is something that's been written about and something that people have a general understanding of,
okay.
generational trauma and issues of self-worth and racial pride and all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we also know about the issues that Indigenous people in Canada face, right? We know about the issues on reservations where people can't get clean water,
Right.
and other things like that, racism that Indigenous people face. So we and when you learn that Indigenous peoples, it wasn't just that they had their land stolen from them, it was also that they were enslaved, not to the extent that Black people in the U.S. were enslaved, but nonetheless, that's a very important experience that one's ancestors would have had. So I was interested in that, and I think the chapter you're referencing is talking about a white person who was captured and enslaved by an indigenous nation who ends up near Detroit. And so I wanted to portray that, and I wanted to portray and imagine the types of conversations and uh, interactions that were happening between Black and Indigenous people at the time. Because as you mentioned, we don't hear a lot about that now. And it's almost as though the two communities, we've been taught to see ourselves as very separate. We have nothing to do with each other. But the reality is, as Black people, we come from our own indigenous traditions. They're not based in this land, but we come from our own indigenous traditions as well. And I think there's a lot of interesting conversation to be had around that. And there's a lot of reason in my mind to explore the history of that and to see what conversations come out of that. Because I think my experience has certainly been that we share a lot in common in terms of historical experience of colonialism with Indigenous people. And we've at times been kind of pitted against each other, and that's interesting to learn about and important, I think, to learn about. And I wanted to portray that in this book. And in fact, the first moment I thought about writing this book was when I came across a photo of a man whose name is John Daddy Hall, and he was of Black and Indigenous descent.
Okay, yeah, I wrote it down here. I wrote it. I said I was going to ask you later in the conversation about
it. Okay, I'll hold up.
Yeah, so I'm going to open the floor for questions. Sure. So I don't monopolize the conversation because I have a lot of questions. But yeah, so Lala, Sarah, Hemilyn, I'm opening the floor for questions so you can ask Kai your questions directly. Okay, Sarah, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. So I've been reading the book and I really enjoyed it, and just especially just the importance, I guess, of storytelling is something that I think is really important just to a lot of African culture. So I really like that part. My question though is, oftentimes, I guess, when you're writing books, especially like historical books that deal with such difficult topics, did you find that at times it was, even like when you're doing your research, that it was hard to read and to write about those kinds of things? Like, how was the process for you, I guess, in like a mental and emotional sense going through writing this book?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, very important consideration, I think. The thing that I love about fiction is, you can deal with whether it's history or modern setting or whatever it is. You have the opportunity to connect with the subject matter in a very personal and intimate and emotional way, right? That's, to me, what makes for good fiction is you get to connect with characters, and you'll be reading and maybe something will make you cry or laugh or just like connect to your spirit and your heart, as opposed to just your logical mind or stuff like that. So I think it's a very important consideration when you're writing about topics that are difficult, maybe traumatic, maybe deal with experiences that one's ancestors may have had that you haven't thought about before. So I certainly had moments where I was working on this and I was like, wow, this is heavy. This is really tough. This is, people are, reading so-called runaway slave narratives, for example, where people talked about what they survived and the types of torture, basically, that they endured, and that was just normal for so long. It's very heavy and frightening to read about. I think the thing that really kept me in a good place mentally, emotionally, spiritually, was thinking about the why. Why am I writing this? And fundamentally, why I wanted to write this was to look for the instances in the past where ancestors have had encountered traumatic and terrible things and found ways to overcome them. Not always. I mean, I didn't want to romanticize the issue. And as I'm sure you're aware, I do reference and in some cases depict instances where people did not overcome or were terrorized or brutalized in some way. But by and large, I wanted, when I was reading history and when I was talking to elders who have knowledge of oral stories that have been passed down, I was really paying attention to where people who were oppressed took their power and where they rose up. I mean, if you read the opening chapter, there's a scene where a slave catcher is shot. That is something that I hadn't seen a lot depicted. But when I started reading the history, it's amazing how many people who were enslaved talk about violence that they did to escape. You know what I'm saying? So there was a lot of that that I hadn't seen depicted in films or in books. So I wanted to dive into that because I think it's really interesting. And more than that, I feel like for me it's psychically healing in a way to understand that our ancestors who went through certain things were not only victims, and they were victims of things, and that should be recognized. But as a storyteller, I'm trying to identify the stories that haven't been told as much. And I wanted to really look and then represent, stories that uplift these instances where people through intelligence and planning and forethought and courage made space for themselves and made space for their family and navigated all of these difficult systems of slavery and oppression and loss of land and expropriation and all of these things. So that was my approach. It's just kind of keeping that goal in mind, and the hope, of course, is that people reading this, and in particular Black people reading this, when they see characters who are who are empowered in meaningful ways, not just empowered all the time superheroes, but encountering real scenarios and finding different and diverse ways to deal with them, that contributes to a sort of a healing that I know I was looking for, and that's important to me. So that's how I handled that issue as a writer.
Thank you. Any other question from any other person? Lala, do you have any question? Hemilin, do you have any question?
Hello. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Thomas.
Of course.
I just wanted to find out. I know that most of us found the book a little different from what we're accustomed to. Even though the storyline is familiar, the narrative was different. But and I'm sure you had your challenges too while writing this book. I wanted to ask you, what was the most challenging part for you to write, and why did you find it challenging? I also know that as a Black Canadian from Ottawa, one way or the other, some of your ancestors, even most of them or all of them, I could say, have a direct link to colonization and slavery. So during your writing, did you find any connections or anything that you didn't know, anything familiar that you could share with us? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. The book is different. That's a polite way to put it. I know that it's, I wrote a book that's not necessarily an easy read, and I fully appreciate that. It jumps around in time and place, and I'm trying to bring in different moments in time and place to tell a broader story. So if you finish it, I appreciate your patience, and I can promise that it does tie together in a way that you may find satisfying, and it does require a little bit more attention to detail than maybe a typical novel. So I think that was something that I realized early on, because that's the type of book that I really like. And I know it doesn't make for always the most popular read, um, but it's important to identify what you enjoy and what's kind of important to you, and having that kind of broad scope was important. So in terms of what was difficult or what was an interest, so I guess there's two questions. One is what was difficult, and one was an interesting connection that I discovered. And the difficulty,
not difficult, because you did write a book, an award-winning book. I mean, what was challenging in writing, in your research for this book? What did you find most challenging that you would like us to learn from? And the other one was, as a Black Canadian of Caribbean descent, correct?
Yeah.
Did you find anything that would have helped with where your ancestors come from? Something like that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Challenging, I would say, in terms of the research, it's challenging to keep track of all of the historical detail, I would say. I'm not a trained historian, and so there's a lot of learning on the go. I was reading, I was lucky enough to talk with a number of historians who helped me, and some of whom read the manuscript before I went out to check for inaccuracies. But it was difficult to portray a world that I've never experienced personally. I've only read about or heard about. So that is difficult. There's a lot of detail. It just meant that I had to, I thought when I set out that it meant that I would have to read everything or as much as possible. And actually what I found was what it meant was I had to read the most important and the most pertinent things very closely and very slowly, because what I found was when I tried to read too much, I would skip over details that were important for scene and setting and character. And so that was a challenge that I encountered, and that's kind of how I dealt with it, was to read slowly, stop at any word or idea or concept that I was unfamiliar with, look it up, make sure I was understanding everything, because that sort of attention to detail is important for a novel. And yeah, in terms of my own ancestry, there's a very meaningful discovery that I made, which was, so my dad was born in Trinidad, Port of Spain, Trinidad, of African descent, in Trinidad, and he moved here when he was only 5 years old, so he didn't have a lot of memory of the place, and I don't have a lot of surviving family members. But I went to Trinidad during the course of writing this book, and one of the communities that I was interested in Trinidad, they're called the Americans, which is a creolization of American, because the history of this group of people is that they were enslaved initially in North Carolina, Virginia region, Chesapeake Bay area. And during the War of 1812, they had an intimate knowledge of the waterways, and the British, who were fighting the Americans, had a very dominant navy. So they were very prominent all up and down the waterways and in the boats. And the Black folks in this region escaped kind of in large numbers, took their whole families and kind of presented themselves to the British and said, look, we'll fight for you. We know the land, we know the waterways, we'll be very effective. They turned out to be very effective soldiers, and contributed to some key victories during that war. After the fact, they were granted land as a form of payment. One of the places they were granted land was Nova Scotia. Another place was Trinidad. That community formed one of the first maroon communities in Trinidad, one of the first free Black communities in Trinidad. Other than that, most Black folks in Trinidad at the time were enslaved. And this community settled and farmed. They formed relationships with indigenous people in Trinidad and practice. They were some of the early practitioners of Ifa, Orisha worship in Trinidad as well, and they've kind of continued that tradition. They called it different things. A lot of times in Trinidad, when you see something like Shouter Baptist or Shango Baptist in Trinidad, that's what it's referring to, because it's an Afro-syncretic tradition. So anyways, interesting community. I was interested in learning about it. And I go down and I start to Trinidad, and I'm looking in the National Archives, and I'm talking to people to learn more about this because it has a link to the several chapters in the book. And one of the elders that I'm talking with said, "Oh, well, what's your family name?" And I'm telling her my family names are this and this and this, and she said, "Oh, well, you're American too."
Wow.
So come to find out, I didn't know because that story had been lost within my lineage. But so these chapters in the book that deal with, for those who haven't got there yet, is the chapters that deal with the character named Chiron. Chiron is meant to represent somebody who could have become one of this community, one of these members of this community in Trinidad. And it was only halfway through writing it that I learned that those are my people. Those are my ancestors as well. So that was that was a huge revelation. I remember learning that and going back into the archives and looking at these names and seeing mention of my ancestors in there, and just having this, just walking through the streets feeling like, am I dreaming? Am I in a dream? I've been working on this book for had been, probably 2 years. At that point, I had no idea that my ancestors could have been these characters. But I learned that halfway through, and it just felt like fate
Wow.
to learn that. And so that was probably the most kind of meaningful personal connection that I found as I was writing.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Now, I think in talking to you, we're more eager to finish. I'm more eager to finish the book.
Give you some motivation.
When you talk about Ifa and Shango, coincidentally, I'm Yoruba.
Thank you. I was going to say that.
I just knew that in you writing this book, because in the beginning you said, I wanted to write a book that a 13-year-old me would have loved to read. So, and I read somewhere that if there's something you want to know about, you just write it. I knew that you must have found something. I was nosy. I wanted to find out. So thanks for sharing that with us.
Yeah. So, Lady, I was going to say something now, that those Americans, if you say so, the worship of Ifa, Shango, and so on. So let me take you further back. So it doesn't, because the history, that means now the history doesn't just stop in Trinidad. For them to have that, they say the body remembers. The body remembers, and what connects us is blood. So back all the way now to West Africa, that's all the way to Yoruba. So that means you have Yoruba ancestry.
Correct.
Welcome home. Welcome to the family.
Thank you.
So now we are claiming you. Yes.
All right.
Mr. Thomas, you need a Yoruba name. So your name is.
So yes.
Oh, my daughter here says your name is Oluwatayo.
What's Oluwatayo?
God is gracious.
Thank you. I accept.
Yes, because when you said Americans and you spoke of Ifa and Shango, I said, that is, it doesn't get more Nigerian and more Yoruba than that. So yes. So I think, yes, so you still need to do more research, because it doesn't just stop in Trinidad. I mean, your journey doesn't just stop in Trinidad. You still have to go way, way back. So you are officially Omo Naija. That is fine. We've claimed you,
All right.
Found out that Trinidad has a unique history as it relates to slavery, because it's a combination of Indians and and
Those people came as indentured servants, but the
Yeah,
Africans in like Jamaica and all those places, majority of them were taken from Nigeria, that coast where they have the ocean, Nigeria, Cameroon, and all those places. So a lot of them are actually West African. So even when you see them, when you see the way they look, you understand, they look very, very West African.
they are us. We are them.
Yes, we are. Yeah. Like I said,
I didn't know that until your book that there wasn't any that our native Canadians were ever enslaved. Like, imagine the atrocities that are buried in history. You know, the injustice. It's no surprise that nobody wants to talk about it. It's something and nobody teaches it at school. I went to Jamaica a couple of months ago with my son, and we hired a driver and went to it because of thanks for the book club, Louisa, because we've read a lot of books regarding slavery and plantations. So I don't know, I don't even think I told you this, but I took the children to see quite a bit of Black history sites and plantations and all of that. And then my son, my very handsome, intelligent son, to ask me, "Oh, mom, were Nigerians ever enslaved?" I'm like, "What? What? Did Nigerians ever pick cotton?" I'm like, "What? You're very smart. You're well based on what they teach you, because I tell him they tell you you're smart and you're an A student because they've given you this much to study and tested you based off of that. If I brought another kid from Nigeria and give you their material, I bet you're not gonna even come close to an A student." So he asked me that, and it's very disappointing because you've sanitized history. You've removed a lot of these things, and you're not teaching kids in the hope that we just forget it ever happened. So I didn't even know that the natives whom we are on their land, we found them here, were at some point slaves. It's fascinating, you know. So thank you, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, thank you so much. So I was gonna go to let me see where you mentioned people's hunger for stories. Yes, people's hunger for stories. Until I came to Canada, I did not realize that the experience of Blackness is very different. For those of us who grew up on the continent of Africa, we are just, I mean, back home I was just Louisa from the Edo ethnic group and an Ishan woman. That's me. But when I moved to Canada, that was the first time I realized, oh, you're Black. But our experience of Blackness on the continent comes with power. But I noticed that the experience of Blackness in Canada, in the beginning, the question I used to ask was, why is everybody so sensitive? Until I started to read and to explore. And I went, oh my God, I didn't know. And I noticed here that people are uncomfortable. A lot of people don't want to discuss difficult topics. Like in the US, I just heard of recent that they were going to add to the curriculum that Black people benefited from slavery. And I went, what the hell? So this takes me now to the question of Arabella in the book. Because I didn't expect, so when I came across, I think, is it The Colored Canadian? Yes, when I came across that, I found it odd that at that time, there was this journalist who was a woman. I would have expected, if there was a journalist, for it to be a white man. So yeah, but I was surprised. So why was the journalist a woman? What kind of stories was she telling? Yeah, so I got curious. I got a bit curious about that because I know that for you to start to be a journalist at that time, did you have the power to write controversial things? So what kind of content was she putting out at that time? Yeah. And why did you bring her in?
Yeah. Well, speaking of Dr. Afua Cooper, she has done some of the research around the real life people who inspired characters such as Arabella. Okay. There were several Black journalists in the region, female Black journalists. The first the first to start a newspaper, the first female Black journalist to publish a newspaper, I believe in North America, was a woman named Marianne Shadd Carey.
Okay.
There was another woman, I believe named Mary Bibb, married to Henry Bibb. So that as a couple, they had another newspaper.
Okay.
But there was, it was a very important movement at the time, because if you think about it, you have this whole population of people who are coming out of circumstance where it would have been not only illegal for them to read, but punishable by torture and death.
Okay.
So the importance to this population of reading and of putting out material and thoughts on paper and putting that out into the world would have been so important. If you think about that moment in time where slavery is still in full effect in the American South. It's not in other places, but there's this movement of abolitionism to abolish slavery everywhere. And one of the main ways that those ideas can spread is through print and newspaper. So it was a very, very important historical moment, and the reason why I crafted Arabella's character as a woman was because I wanted to refer back to people such as Marianne Shadd Carey, who were Black female journalists at the time. It's kind of amazing to think about it. Mid 1800s, Black women leading and creating this sort of content. In terms of what they were writing about, journalism in that moment in history looked quite different than we expect journalism should look from a modern perspective.
Okay.
The main differences that we're looking at here are, in terms of the style, the journalism wasn't necessarily only a means to distribute the news. It was that, but nowadays there's more of a taboo around subjective opinion and a style of journalism where you're trying to convince somebody to do something. Journalism nowadays, the standards of it are such that you're only supposed to say the facts, right? And you're supposed to report the facts, and I think that's probably for the best, But all that to say, in the 19th century, it was that wasn't a thing. So it was you write what you think. You absolutely report stories that you think might be interesting to your readership. But when I was looking at old records of these newspapers, you came across, a lot more opinion pieces, I guess I would say.
A lot of fake news everywhere.
Yeah. A lot of propaganda, from all sides of the political spectrum. That was normal. It was very, very normal. Okay. One of the things that this journalist, the real life journalist Marianne Shadd Carey, wrote was a treatise on trying to convince the Canadian government to allow for what she called the colonization of Canada West, and what she meant by that was the settlement of Canada West by free Black people. So she was an advocate for Black people settling, what's now Canada. It's kind of a complex position when you think about it in terms of Black folks' relationship to Indigenous people. There was definitely a way in which, in this moment in time, there was a lot of impulse from Black people to be part of the colonial project, and that didn't always mean trying to exterminate Indigenous people, but it sometimes did. In the American South, for example, if you've heard of the Buffalo Soldiers, this was exactly what it was. Black people who were recruited to hunt and kill Indigenous people. In Marianne Shadd Carey's case, she wasn't advocating for literally exterminating Indigenous people, but she was advocating for Black people to participate in the the colonial project of claiming land in the name of Canada, a white nation. She was appealing to the white nation of Canada to be included into the settler colonial project. So it was just a very interesting moment in time, I found, and those sort of topics that were being discussed in these newspapers, and of course, lots of work on abolitionism and raising money and organizing for the Underground Railroad. Often these publications would be intimately connected with the operations of the church, usually the AME church, the Methodist church, or Baptist occasionally. Were very involved in Underground Railroad activities. And so they're all kind of connected: school, church, print. They were all connected and organizing together. So that's the character that Arabella is really meant to represent. And that's why I kind of chose to write her as a woman and as a very kind of strong.
Okay. So my question now is, so who was reading these papers? Because if I remember very well from what I have read, reading and writing was illegal for enslaved people.
Yeah.
So if they came through the Underground Railroad and the community of Dunmore was like some sort of safe haven for them, that community, it means there was a limited, maybe 1%, only maybe about 1% of them could read. So who was reading these papers being put out there?
Well, the idea is that these communities would be teaching each other to read, and so
okay.
The idea is that you arrive in a community, even if you can't read or have very limited capacity to read, you being part of a community such as this now have access to a school, now have access to literacy, and with whatever time you had, that would have been a very popular endeavor for people. So people would learn to read in these communities, and beyond that, the readership, it was meant to, for example, in Marianne Shad Carey's case, she was writing not only to Black folks, but sometimes explicitly, she was writing to white people to try and politicize them, to try and bring them into the project of abolitionism. Because if you can imagine, back in this day, you don't have TV, you have limited news, a lot of it is propaganda. There was a need for Black people to write, to literally educate white people, in this case, of the conditions of slavery, so that they would have more sympathetic allies for the cause of abolition.
Okay, so I'm coming to the question of John Daddy Hall, but Laide, you have your hand up, so I'll let you ask your question quickly, and then we go to John Daddy Hall.
I just wanted to add that to your question, you because we're talking about over 350 years of slavery. So in saying who reads these things, at some point people became literate, right?
But not when they were enslaved. Not when they were enslaved. Remember, when they were enslaved, it was just a percentage.
In order for the Underground Railroad to be successful, there was some kind of literacy.
It was maps. They used maps.
Yeah. Maps. So which required a little bit of, I'm just saying that slavery happened for so long that there was time for people to go through several stages, and for the slave owners to recreate responsibilities and roles, that's what I just wanted to add that. I don't know if it's relevant,
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think the fact is, based on what I have read, enslaved people weren't always literate before escaping. There are other ways of knowing and being able to find your way. So sometimes it's following word of mouth. Often it was knowing how to read the land, which is not is a different type of literacy, I guess you could say. Knowing how to find north, knowing how to find One of the books that I read that was really interesting was talking about how iron workers and blacksmiths were a very important series of communities in the Underground Railroad that you don't hear so much about. But what was really important was that a lot of enslaved Africans had pre-existing knowledge of metalworking based on indigenous traditions of metalworking, and they were often in charge of the forges and these metalworking community. And so, for people who had that knowledge, they knew how to find um, these forges along the way, and they knew how to who was safe to connect with, and all of these things. So there were many ways that people escape. Sometimes, as you're saying, Lisa, sometimes the 1% or whatever who has managed to learn how to read, they can read newspapers, maps, whatever. And more often is people who figure it out without knowing how to read and using other ways of knowing.
Okay. Okay. So talk to us about John Daddy Hall. My sister lives close to Owen Sound.
Okay.
Yeah. So when I saw it, I went, oh, okay. So yeah, I looked him up. I took a look at his photo. Yeah, but talk to us about him.
Yeah, I encourage everybody to go check out Owen Sound if you have not. They have I don't know, I'm assuming they're now celebrating again after COVID, but every August 1st they celebrate Emancipation Day. They have a wonderful festival, black choirs. They have there's a lot of black folks who have roots in the area. So it's very interesting, going to this rural Ontario town and seeing elderly black people who can trace their lineage 6, 7 generations in that space. So yeah, Owen Sound is where John Daddy Hall ended up. I came across this picture of him years ago, and it just captured me as a very distinctive picture. He's kind of a very old man looking straight into the camera. He has a cane. He has some sort of animal hide over his chair. It's just a very striking picture. And I was looking at the picture and thinking about how amazing it would have been to have a portrait like that in this time, because this would have been very early on in the evolution of photography. So this would have been the first time that a lot of black people, probably 99% of black people, could ever have an image of themselves. Because if you think about it, previous to photography, if you wanted an image of yourself, you had to get a portrait done, which would have been very expensive, very prohibitively expensive. So I was looking at it and curious about who this person was and what his story would have been. There's a historian named Peter Myler who has done a lot of the work about John Daddy Hall, so I always acknowledge him as somebody who I learned a lot from with regard to this person. John Daddy Hall, as I mentioned, he had an indigenous parent and an African parent. And he was born somewhere in southern Ontario, it's unclear where. And he ended up fighting in the War of 1812, not for the Americans or the British, but for the indigenous contingent. And the thing that I learned about the War of 1812, which is very interesting to me, because growing up in Canada, you learn a little bit about it, because this is kind of considered to be the first moment. This is before Confederation of Canada, so there was no Canada. But this was often considered to be the first moment where the Canadian identity began to form. And so how I learned it in school was War of 1812, in Canada, the French people and the English people and the indigenous people banded together and defended against the Americans and formed this kind of sense of unity. Because previous to that, you would have just been British, you would have been French, you would have been any member of an indigenous nation. You would have been black, which probably meant you were enslaved, and that was it. And so this was taught to me as the first moment that Canada began to kind of emerge as an identity. So I was interested in the moment, and I learned that John Daddy Hall fought for this man called Tecumseh, who was indigenous. He was his nation is called the Shawnee, and the Shawnee and he had this vision to create a pan-indigenous nation that would have occupied a big swath of territory that would have gone from Ohio all the way up to Ontario. And this came very close to happening. It would have made the geography of North America very different from what we know it today. But he was killed during the war, and the British didn't make good on the promises that they had made to him, and this never happened. So I thought it was interesting. John Daddy Hall fought for this person who had this vision of indigenous independence, nationhood, and so on. He was captured during this war and enslaved, sold into slavery in the South, in the southern U.S.
Oh, wow.
Survived something like 2 decades of enslavement and ended up escaping. He swam across the Ohio River and escaped and made his way all the way back up, first to Toronto and then eventually to Owen Sound, where he became the town crier. So talk about the news in an era where not everybody is literate. His job was ringing the bell and shouting out the news to the townspeople. And so he was the first town crier of Owen Sound. It was a very important role. He supposedly lived to be 115 years old. So this kind of mythologically long life, and I thought that was pretty interesting as well. And so initially, when I set out to write the book, I wanted to follow his life quite closely, and I decided not to do that because I didn't want to presume to know, all of the intimate details that fiction can portray. I didn't want to do that for a real person because it didn't seem respectful to me. I wanted to fictionalize and come up with different things. And so the name Lencinda actually came from one of the census records of Owen Sound. And this was one of the names of one of John Daddy Hall's many children. And when I read the name, I was interested and started to try and write Lencinda as a character, and she kind of became the protagonist of this novel. But John Daddy Hall was a real person who I owe a huge debt to for the inspiration to write this book, and his story kind of set me on this journey of research that allowed me to write this novel.
Oh, okay. Now that I've noted it down here. When next I visit, my sister lives in Port Elgin. I will go to Owen Sound, just to take a look and just to get in that feel and make that connection. I was going to close the conversation with asking about Lencinda, but I wanted to ask a question about the connection to the land, because I noticed that the enslaved people in America, when they talk about going home, they talk about going to the motherland, Africa. But in the ones who made it to Canada seemed to get to Canada and find it more, or to feel at home. That is because when I was reading through, I was just thinking, I was waiting to see, okay, let me see, is there anybody yearning for home? But you also brought some sort of an element of folklore into the story. Because when was it Cash? I think it was Cash that was talking about. Was it Cash who was talking about the woman who was connected to the water, and will go for walks, and when she was crying and the tears dropped into the ocean, it made the water. Yeah, that for me was almost like folklore. And I went, it's interesting how we are still the same. We are very, very much, we are the same. So what is what is it with the connection to the land for Black people in Canada?
So that's interesting that you have that observation. I think what I was trying to portray in the book was not necessarily a connection to the land that was specific to Canada. I think what I was trying to portray is something that I was, again, coming across in historical text, which was that even as enslaved people, a lot of Black folks developed a significant amount of expertise with the land, a significant amount of comfort, knowledge. The land in and of itself became a place of escape, a place of sanctuary.
Okay.
and a place of nourishment for a lot of people. And I think that was an important piece for me because I think that since the prevailing idea is that as previously enslaved people, as people whose ancestors were enslaved to work the land for a lot of Black folks has a connotation of trauma, discomfort, and negativity. So you don't, it seems to be the reason why a lot of Black folks are not interested in things like farming or camping or being outdoors. There's a movement for sure where people are getting more interested in this sort of stuff, and that's my day job basically. I work at a farm that educates Black people and brown people, people of color generally, how to farm. But I was looking at the historical texts and the historical examples of people who have escaped slavery, and they're talking about they're demonstrating familiarity with nature and with land that is just extraordinary. They have to know how to evade dogs. They have to know how to identify places where they can hide. They have to know how to blend in to the landscape in such a way that they will not be perceived. They have to know how to provide for their own food when they're on the land. This is a level of expertise that not a lot of modern people have with the land. And that is something that I was interested to portray. And in terms of folklore, I think absolutely, Black folks in the diaspora have retained our traditions of folklore to the land. So that was, I grew up reading, Caribbean folklore and listening to Caribbean folklore, for example, and all of it is very intimately connected with the land. That's why the animal tales is such a big thing, because it's a form of understanding that we are not so different from. I mean, there are differences that humans have, but we're not so different from the nature that surrounds us and that sustains us. Yeah. And so it was important to include several different examples of that, of how folklore can help us as people understand who we are. It can help to activate power in us. It can help to inspire and remind us of our connection and our ability to do certain things. So it has all of these kind of important important jobs to do in our lives. It has an important meaning in my life and in the life of these ancestors that I was reading about.
Okay.
So that's where I was coming
from. All right. So talk to us about Lucinda, because I struggled to make a connection with her. It was in the course of the conversation, and in the beginning I realized, oh, she's high yellow. Yes. And in my mind, I'm like, But why did my thoughts keep going back to the fact that she's high yellow? And I don't know why. Because I could have just gone, okay, she's just a character in the book, that's fine. But I don't know. It kept going back to, she's high yellow. She's high yellow. Talk to us about Lucinda.
Yeah, I mean, that element of her character is important in that it connects to the fact that she's a little bit on the outside of her community. She's high yellow, so racially she's distinguishable and she's noticeable as being different. She's mixed race essentially.
Okay.
And that puts her on the outside in a sense. Okay. She is a young woman who's figuring out, who she is. She's angry about a lot of things. Mm-hmm. She feels, I think, deep down, she's afraid of being ostracized from her community, and that causes often conflict with the people who she's around. She's a little bit fiery in that respect. Okay. And fundamentally, the book follows Lincinda's perspective, even when different stories and voices come in, if you pay attention, you'll notice that the book follows probably 5 days over the course of her life. And all the different stories that emerge are either people who she's listening to or she's reading.
Okay.
So, this is her story in a way, as she learns to tell her own story, because she's had experienced certain traumas and certain difficulties that have prevented her from being her own voice, from having her own voice, from telling her own story, from feeling comfortable being herself in the world that she's in. So in many ways, it's her story is the story of a writer, and of a writer trying to figure out how to tell stories. But yeah, you're not the first person who's told me, like, I didn't really like Lindsay. I didn't like how she was talking to Cash, the old woman. I didn't like how she seemed entitled to certain things, and I think it makes sense because she's a flawed character. She's not.
Yeah.
She's got some issues. And
sometimes I found her snobbish. Sometimes I felt she could have had more empathy. Like in the beginning when she met the woman in the cell, I felt she could have had more empathy. And then sometimes I go, who the hell is she? Who the hell does she think she is? Yeah. But now that you've explained it this way, I understand. But I want to wrap up this conversation with a very strong question. And that is taken from your book, where you said, history does make us who we are. So I want to ask, do you think history makes us who we are? 100% or 50%?
Gosh, I would say, I guess if we're talking percentages, I would be more inclined to say 50%. I think the point there is that it's a strong influence in. I believe that history has a strong influence in how we define ourselves and how we act and who we are, right? And I think one way to think about it is from a collective sense. A nation such as Canada has to define itself based on its history, what it's done. That's how it tells its story, right? From a collective sense, but also from an individual sense. I think I have 2 babies now, so I'm getting to observe, like, what is it? Is it nature or nurture that really makes you who you are, And then as much as they each kind of have their own personalities and they came out very different in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
The ways that their history, their personal history influences them is very significant, I'm finding. I'm beginning to have an appreciation for how important that is. And not to mention, sometimes the older one who's talking a bit now, she'll say things or she'll act a certain way around different people, and I get the sense that she's drawing on some ancestral memory too. I think there's ways that makes us who we are as well, and I would say a solid 50%.
Okay. So are you working on anything new?
Yeah, I am. I'm working on a next novel, which will be something of a sequel to this one. Okay. And it's not going to necessarily pick up right where this left off, and it's going to have a different cast of characters, but safe to say we'll see Lincinda and Cash again in the next one, so I'm excited.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. I would like to say, before we go, please, we usually take a group a photo. So for those comfortable with putting on their cameras, please turn on your cameras so we can take a photo. So we
I just have to grab my book. Sorry.
Okay. Let's do the gallery view. Okay. Oh, Hemilyn, are you done walking your dog? Okay.
Yes, and I'm in Jean Coutu, shopping for a card for a wedding. So sorry.
No, it's okay. Lady, have you got your book with you?
Okay.
Okay, have you got your book? Okay.
1 minute, 1 second, honey.
Okay.
I got it, but
Yeah, but we can't see you.
I'm on camera though.
No, we just see.
Oh, I see. Okay, my bad.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. So, Kai, I would like to say a very big thank you. This is the last meeting we had was in May, and then our June meeting was in person. Yeah, sometimes, yeah, we are usually more than this, sometimes we're less than this. But all the same, I just want to say thank you very much for making our time to join us. Thank you for also educating us about Canadian history. For those of us Africans, thank you for educating us on Canadian history, because a lot of this has been romanticized through the years. When I was growing up, anytime I read about indigenous people, it's always about Geronimo with his long hair and how, he's a hero. Until I moved to Canada, that's when I realized the brutality and a lot of injustice they experience. So I would like to say thank you very much for using this book to educate us on that. And also, I think our paths didn't cross by chance. Our paths crossed for a reason. So to also let you know that you have Nigerian ancestry, whether you like it or not.
I like it.
So, yeah. So when you're doing your research and you research more into Ifa and Shango, Nigeria, Yoruba, that is where you started from, all the way to Canada. So I would like to say a very big thank you again.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm showing up with my Shango red.
Yeah, you see.
And no, it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this conversation, and I look forward to continuing to follow your book club, and maybe next time we can do it in person.
Yes.
When I'm
that would be great. That would be great. That would be great. Thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon.
You too.
All right. Okay.
Bye for now.
All right.